Sorry, guys, I was interrupted briefly. Let's continue on. So, a couple of different terms on this slide, two key terms. Working memory you can think of as all of the working knowledge that you have on hand in order to go about your day-to-day activities, right? So, active, ongoing, and also temporary representation that is kept, that is maintained for a short term in order for you to move from one activity to the next. So perhaps your days and your schedule have become a little more mundane than they were 3 weeks ago. But imagine when we were on campus and we were in class, you had to know which lecture hall you were going to when, at what time, what work shifts you maybe had that week, and did you have any social commitments? You had online quizzes, perhaps bonus assignments due. Maybe you play sports or otherwise incorporate physical activity into your daily life, and all of that information for you to go about your week, right, from day to day, hour to hour, that all comprises working memory. Okay. And then cognitive control is your application of working memory to being engaged in a current behavior. So planning, task switching, paying attention, inhibiting, let's say, socially inappropriate behaviors. So an example that I would give if we were in the lecture hall is you're here, you're in your 306 lecture, but maybe you've got a 305 exam coming up and I'm talking, but you're actually studying for 305. Maybe you're panicking because you have a 326 exam coming up in the next 24 hours, and maybe you take a break from everything to jump on Instagram. Maybe you're getting a text from somebody you care about, and at the same time you're in lecture, in your seat, hopefully acting appropriately, right? So that would be an example of all of the things, if you imagine yourself sitting in lecture, that would fall under cognitive control. Okay, so working memory is all of the information you need to go from hour to hour to day or day to day within a given week, and cognitive control is your application of working memory and your manipulation of working memory, okay, to multitask and behave appropriately, and so on. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. All right, so we described the prefrontal cortex as kind of the chief executive that is in charge of working memory, that is in charge of goal-directed behavior, planning, foresight, reasoning, decision-making, control, inhibition of socially appropriate behaviors, and so on. And in order to act as a chief executive, the prefrontal cortex integrates both external and internal information. So there's a lot of connections to posterior regions of the brain where very often different types of sensory information will pool. And so another type of memory, transient memories, are just that. They're short-lasting representation, but they're the first stage through which external information, right, or information from the external world, something you see, something you experience, enters consciousness. And it may remain transient, right? Back when you got the bus up the hill in the morning, at the end of the day, you probably didn't remember everybody who was on the bus with you, but hopefully you remembered what you learned in lecture, which has the potential to become part of long-term memory. Okay, so then there's two types of transient memories. Okay, so transient, short-term memories. The first one is sensory memory. So that's your transient, momentary memory of something you've just experienced. And I'll use the example of the bus. You're on the bus, you see people on the bus, maybe you recognize somebody on the bus, but at the end of the day, you probably don't remember all of those people that you saw on the bus. That would be an example of a sensory transient memory. And then the second is your short-term memory. An example of that would be holding on to a series of digits, let's say a phone number, long enough to punch it into your phone, right? So you look up a number, you repeat it over and over to yourself quickly, you plug it in your phone, and then you probably don't remember that phone number much longer, but you held on to it long enough to use it. And so there does seem to be kind of a magic number of digits or letters that we are able to recall, and that magic number seems to be 7. We're pretty good at hanging on to 7 digits, right? 7 letters, 7 numbers, 7 emojis, but once it gets beyond 7, we are less equipped to hang on to that information in the short term unless we are able to encode it, right? If we can link it to something else, link it to something that we already know, we have a much better chance of remembering that in the long term. And you probably have ways, I mean, you've taken courses where you have to memorize a lot of information, and you probably have your own tricks, right, to help you memorize things better. And one of the best ways to do that is to encode, is to link new information to information that you already know. Rehearsal, right? Repeating a number over and over would be an example of rehearsal. So there's probably a reason why phone numbers are 7 digits long and not something longer than 7 digits, well, without the area code. So magic number 7 and encoding is important. So if we were in lecture, I would do this with you. I would put up a series of letters on a slide, and I would give you something like 2 seconds to transiently, right, and short term remember them, and then write them down as quickly as you could, and then we could get an idea in the class of how many of us can remember 3 or 4, how many of us can remember 7, and usually in my experience there's a couple of super rememberers that can get all 12 of these letters or a slide that's similar to this. So I won't do that with you in this context, but I will post the link that I usually use. So you can do this on your own. And it's automated, it's online. There's 6 different trials. And with each trial, the number of letters that you're presented with gets longer. And so for your own interest, see how many letters in each of these trials you can remember. And that should be a really good working demonstration of your short-term transient memory. Okay, I'll let you do that on your own. It's a University of Washington link. I'll post it to the usual place in the helpful links. You can find it there, and you don't need to do this with a pen and paper. You can open a Word document and type the letters in that you remember, but it might be something fun to do with your quarantine team, whoever you're with. Maybe other people want to do this with you. That might be fun. Okay, so then you can use this. This tells you the total number of letters that were there. You're going to write down how many you remembered, and then you can calculate a percentage. And then you can compare it with maybe your brother, your sister, your boyfriend, your girlfriend, mom and dad, whoever you're with right now, and see who's the best rememberer of Team Quarantine. Okay. All right, so we've defined working memory already. Working memory is a type of short-term memory. So working memories are short-term memories, but not all short-term memories are working memories. Hopefully that makes sense. So you can think of, I'm just denoting STM to save space on the slide. This is the short-term memory versus LTM would be long-term memory. Okay, so holding on to something long enough for it to affect your behavior, punching your number, punching somebody's number into your phone so you can text them or otherwise. And then temporary retention of information that has either just been experienced, that would be an example of a sensory transient memory, or something that's just been retrieved, right? You can also retrieve something from long-term memory. Maybe there was a time when we used to memorize phone numbers. I don't know if you guys memorize phone numbers anymore, but I still remember like some of the actual household phone numbers of my childhood friends, and I could recall them from memory, and that would be temporary, or that would be an example of temporary retention of something that I've just recalled from my long-term memory. And then that information can be used for goal-directed behavior, and we talked about things like going from one class to another or multitasking while you're sitting in lecture. Or it could be used to retrieve other information from long-term memory. Maybe I remember a childhood friend's phone number, and maybe also I also remember, or associated with that memory, I know where they live and the street that they lived on, or something would be an example. And then this is getting a little psych heavy here, but just know that visuospatial, so visual information, where things are in space, and verbal or auditory information seems to be stored separately, but we won't get into that detail. Or we won't go beyond that level of detail. But if you think of this as your prefrontal cortex and the central executive, you can think of visuospatial information as being in one place, and auditory or phonological information being elsewhere. But the central command, the CEO, the prefrontal cortex, is able to access both, but it's stored in different regions. And then in terms of executive function, the central executive in the prefrontal cortex will monitor, manipulate, provide cognitive control, and manage traffic, add information, delete information, shuttle information between short-term and long-term memory, and use that for reasoning, problem solving, and planning. Okay, so hopefully it's becoming clear how the prefrontal cortex can act as a kind of chief executive in the brain. All right, so we said we were going to focus on the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, and so here's an example of something your dorsolateral prefrontal cortex helps you out with. And so this is conflict-induced behavioral adjustment. So in the real world, down here at the bottom, in the real world, an example of conflict-induced behavioral adjustment is when you're faced with conflicting rules, you have to decide what to do, right? Am I gonna go for option A, or am I gonna go for option B? And there may be conflicting rules that make that decision difficult. So that's what your dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is doing. In terms of demonstrating that to you in a simple way, we can do that with the Stroop effect. And so the Stroop effect, and here's an example of conflicting rules. Okay, when you look at a printed word, and the word is the same color of the font. Here I have the word red, and I've also colored that word red. It is easier for you to tell me the color of this word when the color of the word and the word itself are congruent. When the alternative would be over here, when I'm asking you to name the color of the font. I'm not asking you to read the word. I'm asking you to tell me the color of the font. That is easier when the word and the font color are aligned. It is less easy, it is more difficult. You will be slower in doing this when the font and the word are incongruent. Okay, and so that's known as the Stroop effect. It's one of the most widely used and most widely cited psychological experiments. Some of you might have done this or maybe read about it. And it helps, or it demonstrates interference. It demonstrates a conflict and the time adjustment or the time delay when there is a conflict. Okay, so keeping in mind how this would apply to the real world, let's go ahead and demonstrate this. And this is much more fun in lecture, of course, when you have 100 people trying to do this at the same time. But you can do this on your own. We'll do it together. But it might also be fun if you have your team quarantine with you, and everybody can do this together, so you can also see variability within the group. So I'm going to put a word on the slide, and I'm going to give you like maybe half a second to call out, to name the font of the word. Okay, so we'll start off pretty easy, and then we might find that things get a little more complicated. So let's go ahead and go. Okay, so you probably found that you were able to name the color of the font fairly easily, well within the time, half a second or 3/4 of a second or so that we had for each slide. You were probably able to do that fairly easily. Okay? But now let's try adding in some conflict. Okay, here we go. Okay, so you probably found that it was a little more challenging to name the font of the font color when the word and the font color were misaligned. So that second round, I imagine, you felt a little stutter, a little delay, right? And maybe if you did that with a couple of family members or your boyfriend or girlfriend, maybe you found that there was also a delay, right? Maybe not much, but I think round two was a little more challenging than round one. Okay, so that's an example of the function of your dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. All right, so cool and hot executive function. Cool executive function, relatively non-affective, meaning not as emotional or non-emotional, abstract situations. Cool executive function is important for critical analysis, for logical thinking, and also for inhibitory control, right? Inhibiting, say, socially unacceptable or less acceptable behaviors. Hot executive function is emotion. So affective, motivationally significant. If there's some kind of reward involved, then very often hot executive function is involved, and processes that are driven by emotion. So you might know somebody who's a little more hot-headed, and maybe their hot executive function tends to win out. And you may know somebody who's always cool as a cucumber, and maybe their cool executive function tends to win out. Okay. So an example would be when an individual is confronted with a problem that is meaningful to them, a personally meaningful problem, i.e., or e.g., for example, there is some kind of reward for a behavior, or there's some kind of punishment for a behavior, or punishment that needs to be avoided. So a reward-based problem or a punishment-based problem, and most often when that is the case, that is a personally meaningful problem, right? Most often hot executive function is involved. So you may have heard of the marshmallow test, or you may know a little bit about the marshmallow test. So I won't make this file any larger by playing it for you on my screen. You can watch this video. I'll post it for you in the usual place, but do please watch the videos that I'm posting links for. Do the activity we talked about a few minutes ago, and please do watch this video on the marshmallow test to help understand to help you understand executive function using a real life example. Okay, so then damage to the prefrontal cortex. We should now be getting to the point where we can probably predict some of the symptomology that's associated with damage to the prefrontal cortex. I won't read this top bullet point for you again, because I think I've said this several times already, but if you know what the prefrontal cortex is responsible for, then you should be able to predict what features or characteristics or abilities of an individual might be absent in the presence of damage to the prefrontal cortex. So damage, intellectual issues, behavioral issues, problems with planning, failure to inhibit, goal-directed behavior goes hand in hand with planning, and dysfunction in the prefrontal cortex or abnormalities or differences in the prefrontal cortex have been correlated with. So I'm not suggesting that this is causative, right? But this is a correlation or an association with schizophrenia, with ADHD, possibly substance abuse, and depressive disorders. So there is likely a role of the prefrontal cortex or differences in the prefrontal cortex when these specific conditions manifest. And in the case of schizophrenia, you remember earlier in the course when we were talking about long-term potentiation and long-term depression and plasticity and changes in the brain, particularly with age. And we said that synaptic pruning must occur during adolescence in order for the normal, healthy, functioning adult brain to develop. And much of that synaptic pruning happens in the prefrontal cortex. So there's a specific correlation or link with schizophrenia. Very often it's a lack of synaptic pruning, specifically in the prefrontal cortex, that may be a driving force or at least an exacerbator of the onset or development of schizophrenia. Okay, and I showed this slide or a version of it earlier in the course, and I would have said a little bit about Wilder Penfield, who was a famous Canadian neuroscientist and neurosurgeon, and he was involved, I would have told you, in a lot of the mapping of the motor cortex and the prefrontal cortex. And so this slide is actually about his sister. After she had a removal of a tumor, the removal of the tumor left damage, or perhaps the tumor itself damaged her PFC. So whether it was the tumor itself or the removal of the tumor, I don't know. I'd have to check. But in any case, the point was that her prefrontal cortex was damaged. And prior to that, having the tumor and the surgery, she had been a very accomplished chef. She would be able to cook, appetizers, main dish, and dessert all at the same time. Imagine, let's say, 12 or 15 different things going on in the kitchen, and all of the planning and goal-directed behavior that would go into that. And so after the removal of the tumor, she lost all of her ability to organize her cooking. She would just move from dish to dish. Some things would remain raw and uncooked. Others would be burnt. And so that is an example, and the specific name for this condition, which she exhibited, is dysexecutive syndrome, right? You've lost the CEO. So it's disrupted ability to think and plan. And dysexecutive syndrome can be caused by tumors or the surgery to remove the tumor, blunt force trauma, so rapid deceleration, perhaps in some kind of accident, and football, right? You rapidly decelerate if you're going forward really quickly and you run into somebody's helmet and they are also coming forward really quickly. And so dysexecutive syndrome has been linked to different types of brain injury, specifically that are common in football. So aside from a deficit in executive function and working memory, but normal long-term memory and skill learning ability. Let me make sure I said that right. Yes. Norm means normal, okay? So long-term memory and skill learning ability are normal because that's not what the prefrontal cortex is important for, right? The prefrontal cortex is important for executive function and working memory. And then deficits in short-term memory, maybe a failure to recall even short sequences. If you've gone back and done that activity, you know how many digits you are good at remembering in a short period of time. But imagine if you could only, or you weren't even able to recall a few of them. And individuals with dysexecutive syndrome are not able to complete a task called the Tower of Hanoi. And if I were to give you a setup that looked like this with 3 rings, and the idea is that you have to move all of the rings from the first peg to the third peg, but you can only move 1 ring at a time, and you can never put a bigger ring on top of a smaller ring. And so if I were to give you this task in a few minutes to work it out, you would be able to do it by coming up with the steps that are shown here. So if you want to think through how this would be done, where this is the starting point up here at the top left, and this is the ending point down here at the bottom right. One feature of dysexecutive syndrome and damage to the prefrontal cortex is an inability to complete this task, okay, which again shows planning and goal-oriented behavior, or a lack of planning and goal-oriented behavior. All right, so the other regions of the prefrontal cortex that we said we weren't going to talk about in much detail, I'll just give you these answers here. So the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, you can see damage or symptoms of damage listed down at the bottom. And this is important because Phineas Gage's injury was specifically to his ventromedial prefrontal cortex. And so excessive emotion, poor impulse control, poor social interactions, socially unacceptable behavior, let's say, like inappropriate crying, anger, laughing, sexual behavior in public. And we can think of all of this as kind of being disinhibition, right? If one role of the prefrontal cortex is to inhibit, right? CEO has control over behaviors that we would normally suppress, that we would normally inhibit. If we lose that function, then you can think of that as disinhibition, right, of things that would normally be inhibited. And so there's also some lateralization. Very often the dominant, which is often the left, not always, but often individuals are left dominant, right? Left dominant, right-handed. Lesions to the dominant region produce negative effect, so a lack of emotion. And lesions to the non-dominant region can produce euphoria. And so the key takeaway is down here at the bottom with the ventromedial prefrontal cortex and these bulleted points, which are frequently associated with damage specifically to the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. Okay, and you probably know the story of Phineas Gage. He was young, he was determined, he was driven, he climbed the ranks very quickly in terms of railroad business. He was a foreman, which means he got to call the shots, so to speak, at the construction sites. And one thing that he had as part of his position as a foreman was a tamping rod. So this would have been used to detonate explosives from a reasonably safe distance. However, an unexpected explosion drove his own tamping rod up through his jaw and out the top of his skull. And specifically, so you can go back and look at the previous slide again, specifically, it was a ventromedial lesion to his prefrontal cortex, left. And he was right-handed, so this would have been a dominant lesion. So prior to the injury, he was efficient, he was promoted, he was hardworking, he could plan, he could organize, he could direct other people. After the injury, he displayed behaviors consistent with what we saw on the previous slide, right? He was angry, obstinate, impulsive, lack of planning, and socially inappropriate behavior, whether it's swearing or angry or other things. So he was disinhibited when it comes to the normal inhibition of certain types of behaviors. And he was knocked out, but only momentarily. He did regain consciousness, and was taken to the closest physician, and he came up on the porch, the physician's home or practice, and promptly vomited on the porch, and the pressure of vomiting squeezed about a teacup full of brain out the top of his head. And he said to the physician, perhaps one of the most understatements in medical history. He said, well, doctor, hello, here's business enough for you. In other words, I'm in a bit of a state here. This should keep you occupied for a while. Anyway, he did recover with time, but these changes to his personality manifested for years after his recovery. All right, I guess I can tell you he went on to work, not in the railroad industry, but he did go on and go back to work, and lived for many more years, but ultimately he died of a grand mal tonic-clonic seizure that we touched a little bit on earlier in the course. And so much of what we know about the prefrontal cortex, we know because of what is perhaps or one of the best studied injuries in terms of neuroscience. All right, I will leave you with some summary questions to work through on your own time. I'll post those links for the marshmallow video, and I'll post the link so you can test your short-term memory. And I will encourage you to stay busy and stay safe, and we'll talk again soon. Take care.